Our first presenter this morning is Phillip Prodger, who is the curator of photography at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, and the exhibition curator for Man Ray Lee Miller Partners in Surrealism. Phillip has a BA from Williams College, an MA from Stanford, and a PhD from Cambridge University in the UK. He has wide-ranging scholarly and curatorial interests in European and American works on paper from the 19th century to the present, with a particular focus on the history of photography. Phillip has held curatorial positions at the Cantor Center for Visual Arts at Stanford and at the St. Louis Art Museum, and has received fellowships from the Smithsonian Institution and the National Gallery of Canada. He's the author of numerous essays and several books, including most recently Ansel Adams at Water's Edge. That show opened just a month or so ago back in Massachusetts. Ernst Haas, Color Correction from 2011. The Mind's Eye, 50 Years of Photography by Jerry Yulesman in 2010. And then Darwin's Camera, Art and Photography in a Theory of Evolution, a fabulous study back from 2010, which I was privileged to be able to be one of the reviewers for. So do please join me in welcoming Phillip Prodger.
Thank you for that very, very kind introduction, and thank you all for coming. I have to say that seeing the exhibition here in San Francisco has been a great source of pride to me, but also a great source of gratitude, because I am very much appreciative of all the efforts that the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco put towards making this show as wonderful as it is here, and I couldn't be more proud of the exhibition as it sits upstairs. As we'll learn today, the whole story of Man Ray and Lee Miller is so spectacularly bizarre that it's hard to separate fact from fiction at times, and I'm particularly interested to hear Stephen Manford talk this afternoon about the Bateau Ivre incident, which I'll allude to in my talk this morning. But you know, it's very difficult because Man Ray, to some extent, and some of the people around him, were prone to hyperbole, and some of these stories were retold over the years, and memories may have shifted. We don't always know for fact what the circumstances were by which certain things occurred. And the best example of that is the very first thing that propels this exhibition and begins the story of Man Ray Lee Miller. It was a day in approximately 1926 or 27. Lee Miller, a young, beautiful, unknown woman, was walking on the streets of New York, and unbeknownst to her, she was in the way of a truck that was barreling down the highway and was about to run her over. Off on the curb, a man saw the accident about to happen, rushed out, grabbed her out from in front of the truck, and she fainted into his arms. That would be a good enough story, except that the man who rescued Lee Miller was purported to be Condé Nast. And when Condé Nast saw the limp woman in his arms, he said to himself, "This is a beautiful woman. I could make her a star." And as a matter of fact, that's exactly what he did. Lee Miller became involved in the fashion industry from the moment of that fateful rescue in 1926 or 27, and quickly became one of Edward Steichen's favorite models. She also appeared, as you can see in this picture by Georges Lepape, on the cover of Vogue, and truly, for a very brief period, was what we would describe as a supermodel today. She was very much the most desirable model in New York, perhaps even in the United States at that point. But it wasn't to last. In those days, the licensing of images was much more fluid and free than it is today. And it turned out that one of Edward Steichen's portraits, the image that you see in the center of this particular advertisement, was licensed to the Kotex company to sell female sanitary products. Now, back in those days, people were a little more squeamish about such things than we are today. But even now, you can imagine if a model licensed her image to a product that was somehow counter to popular taste, that would bode ill for her career. And that's exactly what happened to Lee Miller. Lee became a sort of persona non grata from the moment this particular photograph was published in the context of the Kotex ad. And all of that fame, all of that success that had built up so rapidly in a couple of years, even months, all came to naught. So she was stuck. Her fashion career was, at least in New York for the time being, effectively over. So she had to go back to Plan B. Plan B at that time was for her to be an artist, and she had already been studying at the Art Students League in New York. You can see her, she's the third person over in the front row of this portrait of students of the Art Students League, and taken around 1926. Steichen was encouraging to her, the school was encouraging to her, and she decided that she was going to rededicate herself to an artistic career. Steichen in particular floated a very interesting possibility. He said there's a man in Paris, a very interesting artist, used to work in New York, named Man Ray, and I think you might be a very good student to work with him. Well, she sort of filed that in the back of her mind, and it wasn't until a couple of months, maybe even a year later, that she would finally encounter Man Ray. Ray was living in Paris. He had been living there since 1921. Now, Man Ray was already a very well-established artist. He had made his name in the New York Dada movement in the late teens and early 20s. This particular piece, which comes down to us through the Roland Penrose and Lee Miller collection in England, is dated 1914. What I love about this particular piece, the signature Man Ray, of course, is the work of art itself. And we see that again and again in our exhibition upstairs, that signature Man Ray surreptitiously placed into particular works of art, sometimes very obvious, sometimes more hidden, but he always loved to play games with his signature. In any case, Lee Miller arrives in 1929. She had been on a trip associated with the Art Students League in Italy. She basically goes truant, disappears from Italy, heads up to Paris and says, I'm going to go find this man, Man Ray, that Steichen had told me about. Well, Steichen hadn't introduced her. She hadn't warned Man Ray that she was coming. In fact, Man Ray was completely blindsided by her visit. There was no indication that this young woman was about to arrive at his doorstep. So much so, in fact, that when she did arrive at Man Ray's apartments and knocked on the door, nobody answered because no one was expecting her to come. And this is something that Stephen will tell us a bit more about this afternoon. How much of the following story is true is anybody's guess. But apparently, disconsolate, the mythology is that disconsolate from not having raised Man Ray in his chambers, she walked down the street to a bar called the Bateau Ivre and engaged in a conversation at the bar with the bartender. The bartender asked what it was that was bothering her, what she seemed a little down, and the bartender, she said that in fact she had come to meet the famous artist Man Ray and wasn't able to find him. The bartender then said, well, you're in luck because he's just walked through the door. She went over to Man Ray, and she was not a person to ask politely, or I should say, well, politely, of course, but she was not a shrinking violet by any means, put it that way. And she goes straight over to Man Ray and she says, hello, Mr. Man Ray. My name is Lee Miller, and I am going to be your new apprentice. Well, Man Ray said there are two problems with that. The first is that I don't take apprentices. And the second is that I'm going on vacation in the south of France this afternoon, so I'll be gone for 2 weeks. Lee Miller says, well, about the first one, we'll talk. About the second one, I'm coming with you on your vacation to the south of France. And that apparently is exactly what happened. Lee Miller and Man Ray, after that very abrupt introduction, take off and go to the south of France. Now, we don't know exactly how the conversation evolved, but in short order, not only was Lee Miller apprenticed, for want of a better term, to Man Ray, 17 years her senior, but they also quickly became lovers. And it's that story of collaboration and of romantic engagement that really fuels the exhibition upstairs. It's wonderful to see these two portraits, both taken shortly after the two encountered each other. One a portrait of Lee Miller by Man Ray, the other a portrait of Man Ray by Lee Miller. I should also add that when we hung these in the galleries, we had the decision to make whether we would have them facing each other or facing away from each other. we decided to face them towards each other. And as you'll see in the show, that's completely appropriate. Now, if anyone ever asks you, what was it that Man Ray and Leah Miller accomplished together? Well, some of the answers are very subtle and very difficult to define. Others are very direct and easy to point to. One of those was the invention, for want of a better term, of a technique called solarization. Well, in fact, we say that they invented it, but they didn't really. They simply invented a way of using this method, which had been discovered as early as the 19th century, and is also known by the name Sabatier Effect. More properly, we would call it the Sabatier Effect. What it is when a print or a negative, certain kinds of paper, certain kinds of film, are exposed to light during development, they reverse and they create this wonderful inky outline that you can see in the beautiful luminescent grays that you see in these fabulous prints, like the one here, the portrait of Leah Miller by Man Ray. This, again, is one of those stories where truth and fiction overlap. The story goes, Leah Miller used to say that she was developing some film in the darkroom for Man Ray when a rat or a mouse crawled over her feet. That gives you a sense, in fact, of what kind of conditions they were living in at the time. Alarmed by this fact, Leah Miller flicked on the light, and the animal disappeared. But then they realized quickly that, in fact, the development had already begun with this batch of negatives, and that they had been exposed to light. And not quite sure what to do, they decided together that they would proceed with the development and the fixing and washing and see what results they got. The results were something like this. We don't know what the first solarized negative looked like, but it was something that Man Ray and Leah Miller both quickly embraced. And in fact, given the Dadaist and Surrealist embrace of chance in the creation of art, it was absolutely perfect. Of course, later on, they wouldn't leave it up to chance. They would develop a very well-defined technique of recreating and controlling this effect. But it became a signature not just of Leah Miller's career, but of Man Ray's, and subsequently many artists have used this. So it's something that Man Ray and Leah Miller together brought to the table. It's really wonderful, I think, to look in the galleries upstairs and compare and contrast what Leah Miller did and what Man Ray did in those fabulous 3 years from 1929 to 1932 when they worked side by side. Sometimes the connections are very direct, as in this pairing. On the left, Man Ray's famous photograph, The Prayer. On the right, an almost equally famous photograph by Leah Miller at this point, called Nude Bent Forward. We could spill a lot of ink and debate at length what makes one a Man Ray and what makes the other a Leah Miller. And there are some good reasons for separating the two. But I show you these two just to give you a sense of how closely at times the two worked and how closely their works overlapped. But there were profound differences, in fact, even from the very first. Here we have two nudes made by of Leah Miller. The one on the left made by Man Ray, the other one made almost the same time by Leah Miller. And it gives you a sense not just of Leah Miller's feminist leanings, but it also gives you a sense of how she perceived herself and why, in a way, Man Ray and Leah Miller were doomed to fail as a couple. Look at the picture on the left. Man Ray has portrayed Leah Miller as soft, sensuous, erotic, titillating. Her head is lowered, the lighting is soft. Everything about it leads us to conclude that it's basically an eroticized portrait of Leah Miller. But Leah Miller depicting herself on the right, we see her with her back stiffened, muscles defined. She looks heroic. She looks like she's about to spring into action. The Leah Miller, as Leah Miller saw herself, was truly a force of nature. There's another thing that we can point to separate Man Ray and Leah Miller's work of this period, and that is the interest or lack of interest in photographing outside the studio. Now, Man Ray did leave the studio occasionally, but for the most part, he was most comfortable when he had studio lights that he could manage, when he had a composition in mind ahead of time, and when he could really control things in an artificial environment. Leah Miller was, by contrast, one of the first artists to go out on the street and look for surrealist things happening in real life. And it was that process of identification, isolation, and ultimately elevation of these little vignettes of life that made them into wonderful surrealist works of art. It's incredible to look at how fully realized her vision was as she went out with the camera. This contact sheet that we're looking at here, it may be a little difficult for you to see in the audience, is not edited, and every single frame is a fabulous, fabulous little work. The most famous, perhaps, of the pictures on this particular contact sheet is this wonderful and iconic photograph called Exploding Hand. Now, this was done in around 1930, again, shortly after Man Ray and Lee Miller came together. And the joke, the surrealist conceit in the photograph is that the hand is reaching out to a door handle and seems to burst into an almost electric flame. In reality, the way this photograph came to be is that this is the door handle from the Guerlain perfumery. We can see that on the contact sheet that I showed you before. And it's not an explosion at all that the hand is reaching into, but the scratching of hundreds, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of ladies' engagement rings with gaudy diamonds eroding and etching the glass right there at the door handle. Now, remember what year we are in. 1929 was the great stock market crash. And Lee Miller and Man Ray lived, for the most part, in poverty in the years that they were together. So not only is there the surrealist aspect of this picture being a hand turning into an exploded hand, there's a surrealist aspect that's social and cultural. The idea that all of these very, very wealthy women were continuing to shop at Guerlain, even during the bleakest period of the Great Depression. Man Ray, I feel, for my money, made some of his greatest photographic portraits of Lee Miller, and he did them for the most part in the studio. Lee Miller was very photogenic, but Man Ray had a very special relationship with her, and the way in which he photographed her reflected his passion for her and his appreciation of her spirit. I love this particular picture. It's simply called Portrait of Lee Miller. I think of it as Lee Miller flying. What's amazing is that her eyes are closed, and it seems as though she's sailing into an unknown future, which was more prescient, I think, than Man Ray would have understood. Interestingly, the way this picture was made, it was simply taken 90 degrees different from the way in which it's presented. It is a photograph of Lee Miller leaning up against a wall, tilting her head back, and all Man Ray has done is printed it and then turned it so that it appears as though she's flying and seemingly defying gravity. Man Ray made some of his most intimate pictures at this time as well of Lee, such as this one called La Dormeuse, or The Sleeper, also from the same period, the Paris period. Amazing to see this beautiful model, the woman who had been on the cover of Vogue, and get in close and realize that her hands are stained with the developer with which she was making the photographs of the time. If you look closely at her fingernails are chipped and worn. She was working hard at that time. But even in pictures like this, there is a feeling of remove. There's almost a voyeuristic spirit in which Man Ray is looking at Lee Miller and yearning for something that's not quite there. There's a synapse that hasn't quite fired, and they're not quite as connected as he would like them to be. And it turned out that they never really were in a stable relationship. Lee Miller had such strong feelings about feminism and the fashion industry, and Man Ray being so much older, so much better established, and having had a long-standing relationship with women such as Kiki of Montparnasse, who were quite happy to be muses. Lee had a very separate, very different expectation about what their relationship would be like than Man Ray did. Lee wanted to be an independent artist. In fact, the apprenticeship of which we speak only lasted for about 6 months. She soon got her own studio, and even though they remained as collaborators and as lovers, she had her own apartment. And they were, as you'll see in the exhibition, they occasionally had furious rows, and those rows could be as bad as her being thrown out of the studio and them not talking for days on end. But there was something bigger going on. There was the idea of a woman being an artist in the 1920s in Paris and asserting her independence and showing what it meant to be an independent woman at the time. Now, Lee was in a very peculiar position because she was a fashion model. She was complicit in that industry of beautifying women and showing them for their looks alone. And it's interesting to look at some of her drawings. For example, this drawing was from Lee Miller's own hand. It's also in the exhibition. It shows a woman pinned to a board and having daggers thrown at her. Interesting to note that the person throwing the daggers in this particular scene is another woman. So it wasn't just men who were to blame for this oppression of women as she perceived it. It was women as well. Well, finally, in 1932, she'd had enough. She'd had enough of being poor. She'd had enough of being in Paris. She'd had enough of Man Ray. And that was the part that broke Man Ray's heart. In 1932, she let him know that she was going to be leaving for good. I believe she left through England initially, but then finally she arrived in New York, where she set up her own studio for a period of time. Now, whatever mental processing that took on Lee Miller's part, she had already gotten over the split. But if any of you have ever been on the other side of an unrequited love affair, if you receive it, it's much harder than if you give it. And Man Ray was thrown into a period of absolute despair. For a few years, he really wrestled, and we could argue that probably for the rest of his life, he had to process the departure of Lee Miller, whom he loved desperately. One of the ways he did that was by painting his famous painting of the levitating lips called L'heure de l'observatoire, les amoureux, or the observatory time, the lovers. It was said, by Man Ray, we must note, that this painting, the original canvas, hung over Man Ray's bed, and every morning, the first thing he would do for about 2 or 3 years after Lee left him was to add to this painting, brush stroke by brush stroke, trying to exorcise that feeling of lost love. Ultimately, I think it's a very positive and a very optimistic picture. It'd be interesting to know how it started out. He later published it with a prose poem that described this happening at dawn, and we see mackerel clouds in the sky, which are the indication that rain is coming the next day, a sort of a cleansing ritual. So there's something very, very positive about this. It's also really interesting as symbolism. Of course, we're looking at Lee Miller's lips levitating in the sky. They loom so large in his imagination, it's as though they've taken over his entire field of view. But there's also another way of looking at this. We could look at the top lip as one lover and the bottom lip as another lover. They're floating in the sky in ecstatic embrace. And then, of course, we could look at this tilted 90 degrees, and it begins to look like female genitalia, which was a trick that the surrealists loved to play. Another of the works that Man Ray made in this period is, again, one of his most famous. It's said that in 1923, he'd first developed the concept for this piece, although we have no extant copies of it, as far as I know, from 1923, so it's not clear whether he executed this or not. But when Lee Miller left him, he attached her eye, a cutout version of her eye, to a metronome and called it Object to be Destroyed. The instructions for the piece were pretty clear. In fact, he published them. He wanted us, each of us, to engage in our own creation of a work of art. If we had suffered the loss of a loved one, we were to cut out the eye of that person and attach it to a metronome, just as he had done with Lee Miller. The idea was to set the pendulum of the metronome in motion until we couldn't tolerate it anymore, and then take a hammer and smash it with one fell blow. The thought was that by the time you smashed that metronome with the hammer, all would be cleared. You would be over that lost love. What's interesting to me is that Man Ray could never bring himself to smash this. He didn't really want to get over Lee Miller having left him. And it's interesting, in 1957, this piece was on display at an art fair in Paris, and a band of renegade students stole the piece, ran down the street with it, and smashed it before Man Ray's very eyes. Man Ray was absolutely heartbroken to see the piece destroyed. But then he realized that it had been insured. And the insurance money was pretty good. And the insurance money enabled him to make 100 new copies of this metronome. And he changed the name. He changed it from Object to be Destroyed to Indestructible Object, which was characteristic humor for Man Ray. In the mid-1930s, Man Ray made a wonderful sculpture, which it's not in the display, unfortunately. It wasn't available to us, but it is reproduced in the catalog, in which he scrawled in funeral style Lee Miller's lips on a sheet of lead and then coiled a noose around it. That was how dark his feelings had become. Later on, his mood brightened, and he began to look at Lee Miller in a very different light. And we don't know exactly when this particular piece was produced, but sometime probably in the late 1930s, Man Ray produced this fabulous, fabulous sculpture. Actually, it's designed as a brooch in solid gold of Lee Miller's lips, literally transforming lead into gold. And that was how his darkness passed. He did brighten, and he did re-engage with Lee Miller. In 1937, she was back in Paris. She reconnected with Man Ray, and they agreed in their own terms to bury the hatchet. And from that moment on, 1937, they were friends again. Deep friends, lasting friends, as the exhibition explains. This particular photograph shows Lee Miller. You get a sense of the bohemian lifestyle that they led in this wonderful piece. Man Ray is there with his new girlfriend, Adi Federlin, and to the left is Paul and Noosh Eleward, their friends. Of course, when the war broke out, decisions had to be made, and it changed lives forever. Man Ray, who was Jewish, decided that it was better for him to leave Paris at that time. He came to California and spent most of the war years here, primarily in Southern California. Lee was indomitable. No war was going to stand in the way of her and making pictures. Instead of moving to safety, she actually rushed up to the front and took an assignment as essentially a war correspondent for Vogue, for whom she was now photographing. Now, at that time, women were allowed to act as photographers in the Second World War, but they were not allowed to get particularly close to the front line. Even from this short introduction, you can understand that Lee Miller didn't accept rules like that, and she rushed headlong into the thick of it. She was there in Saint-Malo when a napalm was dropped on the city. She was in Alsace when people were fighting house to house, and she was present at the liberation of, perhaps most profoundly, Buchenwald and Dachau, when those concentration camps were found. Now, she photographed, you'll see upstairs, there is a small part of the display that introduces us to Lee Miller in the Second World War. Some of the pictures she photographed were so grisly, so appalling, necessary, but appalling, that she never fully recovered from the experience of making them. After the Second World War, she effectively gave up being a photographer. That's why when you go through the exhibition, her contribution really more or less ends with the end of the Second World War. But it wasn't the end of their relationship. It wasn't the end of Man Ray and Lee Miller. Man Ray knew how much Lee Miller had suffered during the war. She basically became alcoholic, and she really struggled to focus on her artwork ever again. Man Ray painted this portrait, which has never been fully explained. My contention is that I think this is a portrait of Lee Miller. It belonged to her ultimately. You can see it's called Absence of White, and it shows every color more or less in the primary color scheme, but not white. And I think what Man Ray was saying at that point was, after the war, this particular painting was done in 1947, that Lee Miller still had all the energy, all the vibrancy, all the beauty that she had before, but her innocence was compromised. And white is the color of innocence, and it's the only color missing in this fabulous portrait. He also sent her gifts designed to cheer her up. This piece, called Consoler for Lee Miller If She Needs One, 1974, was designed as a little optical toy. It has a peephole from a hotel door attached to a cigar box, the idea being that if she needed a mental reset, if she needed to see things a little differently, all she had to do was hold this up to her eye and things would come into view a little differently. He always looked out for her, and he never lost touch with her completely from that time in 1937 when they got back together. The show concludes with this portrait and a letter. The portrait, I've been asked to explain this a number of times. What exactly is the expression on Man Ray's face, and what exactly is the expression on Lee Miller's face? This was on the occasion of the opening of a Man Ray retrospective, organized, interestingly, at Roland Penrose, Lee Miller's later husband's museum, the Institute of Contemporary Art in London. Man Ray was there for the opening of the show, and this portrait taken by photographer Eileen Tweedy shows the two of them in later years, 1975. There's something magical about these two people together. When you look into their eyes, you look at the gesture of their heads, there's something that's passing between them that's hard to explain in words. The only thing I can say to really explain this photograph is to point to the final letter in the exhibition, which in fact is the last correspondence we know of that Man Ray exchanged with Lee Miller. It's so interesting. In the display, you can only see one side of it, but the other side that's covered is a letter to Lee's husband, Roland Penrose. So there were really no secrets between them. But the side that you can see is a letter to Lee. Lee has written to Man Ray. It was fairly prosaic. She wanted to know if a particular work that a collector had was a Man Ray or not. She suspected that it was not, and Man Ray wrote back to confirm that that was true, that it was not actually by him. But then he goes on to explain that at this stage in his life, he's suffering, his health is deteriorating, he's taking pills, they never seem to work, he's walking with a cane, and he doesn't really engage in correspondence of this kind anymore, except, he says, to people whom he loves. Like you, he says, I love you. It was the last thing he ever said to her. Thank you.